Hi everyone. We're going to take a look now at our final instructional model, constructivist instructional model, and it is usually for instruction known as learning communities. But I've added communities of practice because that's a much more common designation in business. Okay, and I want to talk for a second about all the instructional models we've been looking at, because I want to point out that there is considerable overlap. I don't want you to feel like the only person who's sitting here going, well, wait a minute, when I look at these examples of learning communities, it seems to me like they're doing project-based learning. Yeah, they probably are. In fact, all the instructional models that we're looking at require some form of collaboration or cooperation among learners. And very often, it's important to understand that when we make categories, nature doesn't have categories. We create categories in order to be able to discuss things, to talk about things, to write about them, especially in articles and dissertations. But nature herself does not, reality doesn't come in categories, okay? So, for example, think about colors. Um, in order to talk about them, we talk about red and orange and yellow, but if you look scientifically at a light spectrum, there is no dividing line between red and orange, or a place where orange shades into yellow and you can say, yes, on this side is yellow, this side is orange. And many of the things we look at in life are kind of like that. And so these categories of instructional models that we're talking about in this class are ways to think about things and ways that we're going to use to think about things clearly. But understand that they're often overlapping, used together, and things kind of, you can look at something and say, okay, that's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Okay. And learning communities and communities of practice are definitely overlapping and interchanged. Um, According to your textbook, and I would agree sort of, the only difference between the two is that learning communities are primarily focused on learning something. So you would see this term used much more often in a school or a university than you will in other places. Whereas communities of practice are primarily focused on producing something or achieving something. However, again, these two can get really overlappy. Think of two examples for, let's say that you have a community of knitters that's around a knitting shop. I think the Athens knitting shop has a whole community of people who knit. Okay, in one way, they're a community of practice. Their practice is knitting, and they are interested in producing scarves and sweaters and all that kind of Afghans, etc. Okay, but they also spend a lot of time learning from each other how to do new types of um, knitting stitches, how to do new patterns, things like that. Any business that has a community of practice definitely has a learning component in there. By the same token, learning communities in schools do have certain products they have to come up with. People have to learn certain things and pass certain tests in order to verify that they have learned them. In your case, hopefully you are part of a learning community in this classroom, but you also need to earn a grade, don't you? And that's, in a sense, that's a product. You've got to get that grade. So again, these two overlap a little bit, quite a bit. Okay. Let's look at some underlying assumptions that people who write about learning communities and communities of practice make about human psychology. And that is, they assume that given an opportunity, most people naturally want to learn and to do good, to produce good things, to do well, to do good, important work. That this is a natural human drive, that this form of this instructional model can take advantage of. Another very vital assumption to this model is that valuable knowledge exists and can be generated at all levels, not just at the top. It's not just the expert, the teacher, the boss who has important knowledge to contribute to the enterprise, the communal enterprise. Certainly, the expert or the teacher or the boss does have, we hope, important knowledge, but that all the knowledge doesn't reside in them. That people who are new to the enterprise, people who are inexperienced, people who are lower in the hierarchy in a business, the line workers, for example, in a factory, all have their own knowledge that they need to bring to the table, and that knowledge is valuable. Another underlying assumption that's very, very Vygotskian is that multiple heads thinking together really are better than one. Okay? When people get together, they can generate ideas and processes and come up with things that no one of them would have come up with before, all by themselves. And also another assumption is that social relationships necessarily impact learning or productivity. Therefore, you can't aim for learning. You can't try to create learning. You can't try to make productivity increase without paying attention to social relationships. And this is a problem we see in both businesses and schools. We attempt to ignore the social that's going on and assume that if we just follow behaviorist kind of rules and stuff, that we can make learning happen or we can increase productivity. And the people who would adopt this model would say that's not possible. Now, some of these things might seem kind of idealistic to you, but I want to call your attention to the last time that you were working with a group of people that you kind of came alive. I'm not saying it happens all the time by any means. It's a hard thing to do, and we'll talk about that in a little. But think about a time when you were working together with a group of people toward a common goal, and it was just like you were catching fire off of each other, okay? Like one of you would think of one thing and somebody else would build on that, somebody else would build on that, and before you know it, you've come up with something that none of you could have done by yourselves. And think about how exciting and how invigorating that is, and how much you want to see that happen again. And I think that some of these assumptions don't feel quite so idealistic when you look at them that way. Okay, so communities of practice have a number of advantages for businesses. For one thing, studies in management for the past 50 years or more have shown that businesses that have true communities of practice have consistently outperformed traditional top-down business models. And that was the so-called Japanese miracle that was 50, 60 years ago that you will study in business courses. That was, and by the way, W. Edwards Deming brought that idea, he called it quality circles, communities of practice, back to the United States and had a huge impact on business management at the time. I think even today, there are some businesses like Costco, which are much more effective because they bring employees in. Employees are a valued and vital and participatory part of the business. And Costco is doing better than most of its rivals. Okay, communities of practice are far more rewarding for workers, both personally, because the worker feels respected and valued, and economically, the worker is paid, putting it simply, and has opportunities to learn and develop and be promoted. That's partly one reason they're so useful to businesses, is that workers in communities of practice become more skilled. They learn from each other, and therefore they're more valuable to the business. Communities of practice encourage innovation. Think about what you heard about the way Google operated early in its life. It's not doing quite so well now, but early in its history, Google had Genius Hour. Everybody from the top down got to spend 20% of their time on a project that was dear to their heart, that wasn't dictated from the top. Everybody had lunch rooms and exercise rooms and the lowest worker could send an email directly to the top. Okay, Google, when it started, was a true community of practice, and it was incredibly innovative, as you know. And communities of practice tend to endure. Businesses that have formed communities of practice tend to survive tough times better, because the people involved, from the basic employee all the way up, are more committed to each other. They pull together better. They solve problems better. Now let's look at learning communities in schools. And this is an adapted table from the chapter in your book on learning communities, looking at the contrast between a traditional classroom and a classroom built around a learning community, what they call a community-based classroom. And I think you'll see the advantages here. In a traditional classroom, the students are passive recipients of information, whereas in a community-based classroom, the students construct knowledge, and they construct valuable knowledge that they share, that doesn't all come from the teacher or the textbooks. And so obviously this is a very constructivist model. You can see that right away. But also we know that that kind of knowledge lasts longer, doesn't it? In a traditional classroom, learning is primarily an individual independent activity. In learning community classroom, learning emphasizes social interaction and engagement. Traditional classrooms, the emphasis is on acquiring information. And in a community-based classroom, the emphasis is much more likely to be on making connections, fostering inquiry, solving problems. In traditional classrooms, disciplines like math, science, social studies are seen as discrete, kind of siloed, whereas in a learning community classroom, very often disciplines are seen as overlapping, and interdisciplinary work and knowledge is valued. In a traditional classroom, the curriculum is built around textbooks, guides, and somebody should have written here, standards. In a learning community classroom, curriculum evolves from the concerns of the student's questions, the student's wondering. Now, does that mean that students are just, I can tell you a bad way to do learning community, because I know I worked with a fourth grade teacher once who went to a week of professional development on a learning community kind of a model, the Foxfire model actually. And she came in to her August class, sat down with her fourth graders and looked at them and said, "Okay, what would you guys like to learn this year?" There was a deafening silence. Okay, that's not how you do it. I'm not saying that the teacher doesn't have things that have to be learned. But what I'm saying is that the curriculum is connected with, and students have input into that curriculum. And it's connected with their concerns and their real lives. Okay, in a traditional classroom, the information is largely restricted to the classroom resources. The teacher and the textbook are the fount of knowledge, whereas learning communities go out and pull information from all over the place, from parents and grandparents, and now, of course, the World Wide Web, just all kinds of places that you can pull it, and information from many places is valued. In a traditional classroom, evaluation is summative and final, focused on grades. In learning community classrooms, even though most of them have grades, the focus is on formative assessment, getting better. And finally, traditional classrooms tend to move along at a pretty rapid clip. There's very little time for reflection. In learning community classrooms, reflection is built into the learning that you do. All right, so if all these things are so wonderful, why are communities of practice relatively rare in business, and why are classroom communities relatively rare in schools? And they sure are. Because creating real community can be difficult. It's not easy. Competition and elitism work against community. Competition, especially in Western European cultures, learning communities took root much more easily in Asian cultures, which are more collective, okay? But in Western European cultures, we tend to be competitive. It's real hard to be in community with somebody and to work with them if their gain is your loss, Okay? If we're in competition, then the better they do, the worse I do. That's why, by the way, my syllabus tells you I do not grade on a curve. Because if I graded on a curve, then that means if some people score really high, the rest of you do worse. That's a bad recipe for everybody helping each other learn. Elitism also works against community. If we assume that some people are just naturally smarter and that the people at the top know more and the people at the bottom should just listen, that's not going to create community, is it? Building community takes time and it takes trust. And it takes time to gain trust. And trust has to be legitimate. So you can't have fear. You can't use fear to motivate people if you're trying to build either a community of practice or a learning community. Goals have to be truly shared. Okay? If I'm in a business and my goal is to spend the least I can on my employees, on my workforce, reduce that workforce cost down as much as possible. And obviously that's not the goal of my employees who want to earn as much as they can. So right there, we have a problem, don't we? We're not going to have a good community of practice in my business if we have those conflicting goals. The same in a classroom, or a school. And you see this all the time with teachers and administration. If administration's goal is simply to get teachers to do exactly what they're told, when they're told, how they're told, and get those test scores up, and teachers' goals obviously are often to really teach and reach most students, obviously you're not going to have a learning community forming in that school, are you? Community is fragile. It can be anyway. It requires goodwill and commitment from most of the participants. A larger community can deal with a couple of people who are not working toward community, but a smaller community can be wrecked by one person who just doesn't care, doesn't do what they should, foments dissonance in the community. And even a larger community can't deal with a good section of people who aren't sharing that goal, who have different, who are just pulling for themselves. And I think we're seeing this right now, honestly, in our country, where the community, our sense that we are in fact one nation with liberty and justice for all, I think that's falling apart because we're all pulling in different directions. And community processes feel, and sometimes they actually are, kind of inefficient. It always feels more efficient, especially to the person at the top, to simply say, this is how we're going to do it. Everybody fall in line. I know what I'm doing. Just do what I tell you. That feels much more efficient. In real life, it's not, because of course people don't cooperate with you and they're not doing what you tell them. So, you're not really getting where you want. But if you've ever sat in a meeting and thought, oh my God, if we talk about this anymore, I'm going to scream. The community can feel, and sometimes is, very inefficient. It's not quick, and we like quick. We want a shortcut. Okay, so anyway, those are what I wanted to tell you about communities of learning, learning communities and communities of practice.